Saturday, January the 31st, 1981, Mishpatim. Please turn in the traditional prayer book to page 71. I thought would be in vogue. It's not much of a ribbon, but I want to keep our eyes focused on the central theme that we are discussing these several weeks, namely the traditional Shacharit service and the central themes that we are finding in it. And we are now at the point where for the past several weeks we've been trying to understand the meaning of a very central concept in the traditional service, the concept of God as creator, what it meant to the ancients, but more importantly, what it means to us, what it can mean to us, because it is a focal point of the Shacharit service, and as we saw last week and the week before, comprehends the entire question of theodicy, or the justification of the works of God to man. It raises the entire question of the problem of evil. To affirm that God created the world is to assume that God is responsible for everything that takes place in the world, and the notion of creativity, which is the way in which Rabbi Kaplan, from a Reconstructionist perspective, looked at the problem, also entails a negation of evil and an affirmation of the transcendence of the good. These ideas were much more obvious in 1934 than they are in 1981. But before moving on to that theme, which curiously enough coincides with the theme of the Shabbaton, the Sabbath itself, because central to the idea of the Sabbath, in Rabbi Kaplan's estimation, was its designation as a memorial of the creation of the world. That is to say, the Sabbath, among other things, symbolizes the creation. And so in any discussion of the Sabbath, as in any discussion of the Shacharit service, we are dealing with the question of creativity and its meaning. Before returning to our discussion, which involves the blessing at this point of our discussion, the blessing on page 71, which you'll remember is a slightly amended version of a verse from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah says, I'm talking about the blessing on page 71, Yotzer or uvorei choshech. Isaiah reads that verse, Oseh shalom uvorei ra. Isaiah's original form from which this blessing was made was a polemic against Zoroastrianism, a polemic against a very important and powerful view of the world in ancient days, which resolved the problem of evil in the world, not by saying that it is simply the responsibility of God, but saying it was the responsibility of a separate principality. The Zoroastrian dualistic view of the world insisted that the only way to understand life was to accept the fact that there were two separate powers in the cosmos, one a power making for good and the other a power making for evil. and that the various problems of life which human beings find it difficult to endure are the result of that dualism, which hopefully will be resolved at in some future era. The traditional Jewish view was diametrically opposed to the dualism of Zoroastrianism. It was a monotheistic view which insisted that God, whatever that meant, created the world and created both good and evil. This question has bothered people throughout the ages, Jews especially, and even more so in our modern era. Rabbi Kaplan is quite unequivocal on his views. We will come to that in a moment. However, I wanted to say a few words about the yellow ribbon, which puzzled me greatly. There was a song apparently in Hair, which some of you may remember, Crazy for the red, white, and blue, red, white, blue, and... So that must be one of the elements that has entered into this incredible emotion outpouring, which I am ashamed to admit I had some difficulty participating in. The last time I felt like that about America was the weekend of the bicentennial, the big boats. I was very jingoistic in the early 60s, but the various assassinations and Vietnam, of course, made it very difficult to get excited about the American flag. I spend my summers in an area where the American flag is used as an affirmation of all that is bad in American civilization and in human morality in general. We all lived through a period not so long ago when the flag was worn proudly as a symbol of some kind of moral obscenity in this country, which added up to various propositions about social activism, equality, justice, and other concepts which religions have cherished for some time. And so for some thoughtful Americans, I hope it's not just a personal problem, for some thoughtful Americans, the flag has been an obstacle to patriotism rather than an assistance. For some thoughtful Americans, the very symbols of American life have become thread-worn, threadbare, naked, vulnerable, and very often used by the people who don't seem fully to understand what American civilization ought to be about at its best. And those thoughtful Americans, I suspect, are a little leery when it comes to crowds waving flags. We've seen too many crowds waving flags in this country over the last 20 years not to feel a little uncomfortable when we see flags being waved by crowds, and also we want to know what exactly it is. And I don't think anybody really knows what it is that overcame the country this week. I think I'd like to read a very brief quotation, which I'm sure you all saw. What a peculiar symbol those yellow ribbons are. The inspiration for them was tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, a popular song a few years ago. It told of a released convict who wrote his wife that if he saw no ribbon from the bus carrying him from prison, he'd simply keep going and start a new life. Though the song is now getting new lyrics, it was hardly apt to begin with. The hostages were in no sense convicts, nor was there any doubt that their families, let alone their country, wanted them back. They bore no shame or need of forgiveness. But the nation that took its anthem from a ribald drinking song also yielded to the pop yellow image and festooned thousands of trees to express its concern. How did this symbol triumph over logic and attach itself to the hostages like a child's decal? Who knows? Maybe America's loss of confidence caused it to lose faith in weightier symbols and left a need for new, flimsy banners. Maybe sturdier symbols require heroes whose lack left a symbol shortage. No matter. The hostages are back, and yellow ribbons are their heraldry. That was a leading article in the New York Times on Thursday, which I thought missed the point as far as we're concerned. I hate analyzing something so emotional as the outpouring this week, but from a reconstructionist point of view, I think we have had a perfect example of the fortuitous, chance and random way in which religious symbols are born. As a matter of fact, from a purely personal point of view, it wasn't until the middle of the week that a friend of mine drew my attention to what the yellow ribbon was about by telling me about the song, and I discovered to my amazement at that point that I was emotionally moved for the first time, which raises the question of whether one is able to experience intense emotions unless one has a mythical context in which to experience it in the first place. This is something that we've discussed so often from this pulpit, that this was a living example how a purely random thing like a yellow ribbon, which comes, well, it either comes from Hair or the song about the the old oak tree. Either way, it is interesting how when we are in the presence of what can indubitably be described, both in Kaplan's phrase, well, it was Kaplan's phrase, but he took it from Emil Durkheim. We witnessed this last 10 days in America an unequivocal example of what Durkheim Kaplan called collective effervescence. And this collective effervescence, instead of latching on to the existing symbols of America, of which there are many, apparently decided to choose something which did not even mean what it meant when it became used as a symbol. Because, as the Times editorial pointed out, these people were not prisoners, there was no question they were wanted back, and so on and so forth. The need on the part of the group picks up anything. It reminds me very much of the way Durkheim, in his book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, describes how the American Aborigines choose any kind of animal or insect or bird as their totem. It is the intense emotional excitement that is crucial. The actual totem that is used, the animal, the insect, or the bird, or the natural phenomenon which is used as a symbol, is relatively unimportant. And as a matter of fact, many of the totems are not even properly thought through artistic creations. They are simple pieces of wood with the barest and vaguest outlines. Everything depends on the intensity of the emotion with which the collective effervescence of the group fills the very flimsy symbols. So here again, there was, for those who experienced and for those who care to understand, a very potent example of what Reconstructionism is at when it draws attention to the fact that two things are needed in order for society to be able to experience this kind of collective effervescence and to be able to identify it and to be able creatively to use it. That is to say, there has to be a myth and the experience, and both are interrelated. It was an extraordinary personal experience to begin really to experience the emotions which I had felt somewhat secluded from. I'm afraid I don't listen to the pop radio, so this song about the yellow ribbon was something that was not part of my training. I don't know how many people knew this song. Apparently everybody who listens to certain kinds of radio did know it, but those of us who didn't, I think, were a little perplexed. But the moment there was this myth, the moment one could see how this random idea about making somebody feel they were wanted by putting ribbons on the trees could be used as a vehicle to express the collective effervescence of the people, one could understand a little more of what Kaplan is talking about when he speaks about the symbols and the sancta and the way in which, from generation to generation, either the existing symbols and sancta satisfy the collective emotion or new symbols are generated. I imagine that the yellow ribbon has now become a permanent part of American sacred symbols. This week we witnessed the birth of a collective symbol which will be used on future occasions which are not the same as this one and will be constantly given new interpretations. This is an example of what we Reconstructionists mean when we speak about the fact that the centrality of peoplehood is what moves religion, but that there is a fundamental need to relate the myth to the collective effervescence, but more curiously, the way in which a new symbol is born when the existing symbols apparently don't seem to fill the bill. I don't think anybody yet understands what the emotional outpouring was. Obviously, the aftermath of Vietnam has something to do with it. Obviously, the sense of frustration has something to do with it. Obviously, the sense of change in the new administration has something to do with it. Obviously, lots of things, and they will be no doubt analyzed. I'm sure in weeks to come, there will be not only articles, but books written on exactly what happened these last 10 days. An initial evaluation from our own point of view is to note that there is an American religion, however weak and frail it may be. That religion is American patriotism. Nationalism is a religion. Where there is a group, there is a religion. This is an essential teaching of Reconstructionism. And when there are powerful emotions attached to events, that group will link those powerful emotions with some suitable mythological matrix. That matrix need not be something mind-boggling. It need not even be something that is totally traditional. It has to be something which is widely accepted by the group and served a group function on some other level in order for it to be able to make the move to the second level. This is a very unusual thing. One can almost imagine this is how the Magen David was born in the first place, or some other central theme of Judaism, which we, or even the menorah, the symbol of the seven-branch candelabrum, which many scholars feel is related to the shape of a particular branch of a particular tree in Israel. That the menorah, in fact, was based on a yellow ribbon. That is to say, at a time when the need arose in the people. And this dialectic between myth and experience, between symbol and experience, should be a source of inspiration to the Jewish people, who have lacked new symbols in recent years and have also, I think to a large extent, suffered from the same tiredness that the American people have suffered from in terms of inadequate, insufficient, collective effervescent experiences which affected the entire Jewish people precisely because of the peculiar historical situations in which we have found ourselves. That may have sounded like a digression, but in fact it is extremely germane to what we are talking about, namely the question of the ability of the society or the nation to afford salvation for the individual, which is the central theme in Reconstructionist thought. Can we be saved? In the ancient world, salvation was of the next world. One followed the will of God in this world in order that one would be saved in the next world. All hope of achieving a state of salvation or fulfillment in this world because of the condition of this world were not even expected. Salvation was exclusively of the next world. We have now moved into an era where we do not have a next world to solve this particular problem of theodicy, where we have to find fulfillment in this world. And one of Kaplan's central teachings, which is the one that we are scrutinizing at this point in terms of its historical context, in terms of Zoroastrian dualism and in terms of ancient Hebraic monotheism, one of Kaplan's central teachings is that society and the cosmos in general must still afford us the self-same absolute security and knowledge and dependability that now that the next world cannot provide us with salvation, this world must provide us with salvation. Without that, Kaplan says, religion cannot survive. I don't agree with him, because I think the question cannot be transposed so easily. The fact that in the pre-modern era men believed that salvation was of the next world, no one can doubt. The fact that the pre-modern civilization was otherworldly, no one can doubt. The fact that we can no longer believe in the next world, at least most of us, I think is also without doubt. The question is, however, this is the crucial question, whether the substitute for the certitude of salvation from an otherworldly next world can be replaced by a total faith that salvation is possible in this world. Now, of course, this world in 1934, which was when Judaism as a Civilization was first published, although of course many of the ideas in it were written down much earlier. Kaplan's ideas begin to be published. I think the earliest article that I know of is an article that was printed in 1909 in a magazine called the Maccabean, which no longer exists. And in 1922, the year in which the synagogue was founded, there was a very important article published in the Menorah Journal, which also no longer exists, which states the essential teachings of Judaism as a civilization. What Kaplan is trying to say is, you can be saved exactly the way the people in the Middle Ages thought they would be saved. Not in the next world, in this world. Question. But this world doesn't look like a saved world. The world that we read about in the Talmud and the Midrash and the Bible, particularly in the Talmud and Midrash in medieval literature, sounded like a saved world. It looked good. These descriptions of the righteous sitting with crowns upon their head, sitting round a table and listening to God giving a Talmud shir, that sounded good. That was the conception of heaven. Can you imagine how many of our teenagers would be turned on by such a conception of heavenly bliss, sitting round a table and listening to God giving a Talmud shir? That's the extent to which we have departed. I didn't dare to ask how many adults have this ideal of eternal bliss. I just raised the question of adolescence. Can we translate salvation from the key of supernaturalism into the key of naturalism? The world isn't saved, we say to Rabbi Kaplan. Rabbi Kaplan says, yes, 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 I know the world isn't saved, but there are salvific elements in the world. If you look around and ignore the black part of the world, if you ignore the sufferings and the tribulations, and although this book was published in 1934, I keep on insisting on published, I do not want to limit Rabbi Kaplan's thinking to 1934. This book is the culmination of, I think, decades of work at the Teachers Institute. He himself delayed publishing the book until he was 54 years old. He was very cautious in these matters. He felt that the argument depended upon its weakest link, and he wasn't satisfied until his 55th year that the weakest link was strong enough. As a matter of fact, in the introduction, he doesn't think it's strong enough even then, but he says, "Schön Zeit. You know, how long am I going to wait with this book now that I'm 54? It had to come out at some stage." But he is diffident about it, and with good reason. The world isn't saved. However, if we ignore the things that are dismal, suffering, pain, tribulation, torture, torment, anguish, depression, anxiety, death, disease, sickness, and we look only and exclusively on those areas in the cosmos, like this week, where you see people overflowing with the desire to celebrate and to worship, where you see people filled with an energy which seems to come from beyond them. Surely the word or the phrase which Kaplan so delighted to quote from this platform, so that those of us who remember him here preaching can never forget this, which became almost like a, you know, like in the 30s, every comedian, every singer, and every music hall artist had a theme song. Even Bob Hope still has one. He's one of the oldies. Well, Carol Burnett has one too. Do they all still have them? I don't know. But in the olden days, I remember particularly from the 30s, there was a special song which always, when you heard that song, you knew they were going to walk on. Rabbi Kaplan developed this kind of thing. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I don't think he ever began, middled, or finished a talk without telling us that the world is so constituted that it can satisfy men's needs, but not their greeds, and that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Spiritual synergy, like Irish coffee. That is to say, the whole, that's what synergy is. Synergism. Synergy means that when you put certain things together, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. God as a glass of Irish coffee. There are worse metaphors and images to think of. That is to say, you put the Jewish people together, you put their history together, you put their symbols and their rituals and their strivings together, and their attempts to be decent human beings, and suddenly all those elements which you can analyze separately, when they function together as an organic whole, generate something which relates to each individual element in a dialectical relationship. That is a way of understanding the meaning of God. God as a synergistic element in the cosmos. Whether we agree with it or not, we must understand what Kaplan says. That is of paramount importance. And so this week, truly, we saw an actual empirical example of what Kaplan means by creativity. This experience, and I feel at a loss because I was out of it until somebody explained to me what the yellow ribbon was doing. As I say, because of the last 20 years of my experience of America, which began with an enormous outpouring of patriotic emotion. No one who has not been naturalized by Judge Irving Ben Cooper and listened to one of his courtroom sermons in the presence of hundreds of Puerto Ricans and foreign nationals of all shapes, sizes, and description. It was the spiritual equivalent of at least 10 Yom Kippurs. You have to know Judge Irving Ben Cooper, and you have to know him when he's on form, and you have to know how he feels about American life. He just sent me in the mail regularly. Every month he sends me copies of judgments and heaven knows what. I have a room full of Judge Irving Ben Cooper's decisions, but this week he also sent me a most moving tribute to his old teenage friend and colleague, Emanuel Seller. This of course is past American history. So this week, I had to put some kind of question mark against my own American religion. I don't know whether all of you know that we have 2 new flagpoles outside the SAJ, which I personally claim responsibility for, but we don't use them now. We had them fixed up in 1963 or 64 after repeated importunings on my part that since we were Reconstructionists, we ought to follow what Rabbi Kaplan suggests that we do and live in 2 civilizations. 1 pole was for the Jewish flag and 1 pole was for the American flag. And the idea was that on occasions of national civic festivity, the flag should fly as they should have flown this week. But I've given up asking for the flags to fly. I don't have the heart for it anymore. During the 60s, one could still fly the flag. At the end of the 60s, the 70s, now the 80s are beginning. Do people still feel the same way about the flag? Do we all feel the same way when we see the flag flying? It's an effort now. It's an effort now. Nevertheless, there was this week something of a kind of a spontaneity, an effervescence, a response to historical events, some kind of a prayerful, thoughtful, meditative, spiritual, national, patriotic. I think jingoism was a very, very small dimension and aspect of what was going on this week. This would come under the heading of what Rabbi Kaplan calls creativity. Something that could not have been foreseen, something unprecedented, because we've had hostages come back to America before. The Pueblo, there was another, what was the other one? Yes, I knew it was a boat. And there hasn't been the same outpouring, so obviously there's some kind of combination of factors going on here. Kaplan would say, if you look at this kind of thing, then you are in the presence of something that's going to get better and better as time goes on. And although the world is not saved now, at this very moment, if you have faith in this kind of experience, if you can believe in the spiritual implications of the yellow ribbon, or what I'm using for a yellow ribbon this morning, if you can believe in the implications, even though it is not full-blown and full-developed and full-fledged, even though what happened this week is only a spark of what might be the case, when Americans all over the country will be able to once again celebrate with pride their national festivals, their national holidays. They will be able to celebrate with pride the exemplifications and manifestations of American justice in the world. Even if we only take this as a kind of an hors d'oeuvre, even if we only take this as a spark, but to believe that what we feel ought to be the full implications of what happened this week, could be. That is a central teaching of Rabbi Kaplan. What ought to be, can be. I have serious reservations about this. Right now I'm simply presenting Rabbi Kaplan's thesis. If we believe that what ought to be can be, then we can believe that the spark that we experienced these last 10 days could sweep over America in 5, 50, 500, 5,000, 50,000. It doesn't matter, says Kaplan. All you have to believe is that every day and in every way, civilization is getting better and better. I'm deliberately parodying the remark by Coué, because the situation is not as simple as that. And the essence of the classical formulation of Reconstructionism depends precisely upon this affirmation. The question then, whether one can have a tragic view of life, the question then of whether one can look at the events of the last 10 days with a controlled and disciplined cynicism, realizing that the same wildness and enthusiasm which we experience today in welcoming return hostages could easily next week or next month be turned against free abortion for women, or integration in the schools, or busing, or any other of the hard-gained advances that have been made since the 20s and the 30s in this country. The fear that many of us has that the same kind of cheering, the same kind of rejoicing can be used for nefarious, obscene, and evil purposes gives us pause when we see it being used even temporarily for apparently good causes, although we do not yet understand perfectly and clearly all the motivations that went into this week, and I don't think any of us ever will. I am simply paying respect to the fact that it was an episode of collective effervescence. It was an expression at least of incipient creativity in Kaplan's sense. The question is whether we can go on from there and say, on the basis of this kind of phenomenon, can we affirm that salvation is achievable in this world? If we can, Kaplan says, we may say that we believe in God, because God is the faith that ultimately the best of that experience this week can be distilled and used positively in every single dimension of American life. The question has been raised legitimately by Richard Rubinstein, whose book, After Auschwitz, I insist must be read in conjunction with Judaism as a Civilization, that the optimistic view of life, which insists that salvation is of this order, is not necessarily linked to the religious perspective. That one can participate in, observe, cherish, and share an historical ethnic religion such as Judaism without believing that that salvation is possible either in the short run or indeed in the long run, that in effect we live on a cooling planet anyway, so that ultimately any notion of salvation must have some astronomical pause, and whether or not adult, mature human beings need that kind of validation to live decent, moral, and ethical human lives, and whether it is not possible in a world in which we acknowledge the good, deplore the evil, endeavor to remove the evil, endeavor to advance the good, without feeling that in order to deplore the evil and in order to advance the good, we must believe that the events and the experiences of this week have cosmic implications. If Rabbi Kaplan were here this morning, he would say that what happened this week has cosmic implications, that we live in a universe which is so constituted that when certain kinds of things happen, such as hostages coming home, human beings can generate synergistically and collectively certain emotions which make them feel larger than life and give them the possibility of enduring, hopefully and in faith and strength and courage, things they would not otherwise be able to endure. The question that Rubinstein raises, and as I say, it is a legitimate question, and I share Rubinstein's view on this particular position. But hopefully both views can be contained in a Reconstructionist approach in view of the fact that Reconstructionism insists on spiritual pluralism, cultural pluralism. So we can say both these and the other are the words of the living God. Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Rubinstein insists that not only is it possible to believe in the possibilities of human fulfillment without necessarily seeing it or believing it to be a cosmic principle, but that in certain ways believing that the cosmos does it for us, even in so remote a way as believing in a power making for salvation as opposed to a God who makes for salvation, to that extent man's autonomy is reduced. Leaning on Tillish's analysis of the God above God, Tillish's insistence that the God who has authority over man to that extent dehumanizes man because he prevents man from becoming fully human, in the same way that a parent who refuses to allow the child to break away totally is preventing the child's burgeoning autonomy from becoming all that it could be. That it is perfectly possible to be human, mature, adult, and a Jew without necessarily sharing the optimistic vision. Let me give you an example of Kaplan's optimistic vision taken straight out of Judaism as a Civilization. It's curious that he is here in a section of Judaism as a Civilization when he's dealing with the question of Jewish ethics and is taking Karl Marx to task for suggesting that every ought is the outgrowth of an is. We find the source of his insistence in the meaning of God, in the meaning and purpose of God, the meaning of God in modern Jewish religion. We find the other side of the coin of his phrase, whatever ought to be, can be. I didn't realize until I read both these paragraphs together this week that what this phrase, whatever ought to be, can be, is a critique, is a polemic against Marxist dialectic materialism. Marx says what ought to be, that is to say our values and our ethics, derives from our relationship to the means of production. That is to say, what is leads to what we feel ought to be. Kaplan says, no, what we feel ought to be leads to is. If we feel that what we experienced this week is good, we ought to be able, by spending money, by training doctors or dentists or whatever, whoever will be responsible for this massive act of spiritual engineering, to create a society when this kind of experience can be generated at regular intervals, like at festivals, Sabbaths, whatever. And therefore, I never realized, in spite of Kaplan's protestations of his empiricism and pragmatism, that this is an extraordinarily idealistic viewpoint. That is to say, volition leads to action. If we will, im tirtzu, einzu agada, what ought to be. That, in a sense, what ought to be can be, could be regarded as a translation of the phrase attributed to Herzl. Im tirtzu, einzu agada. If you want it, it can become real. What ought to be, Herzl was saying, and this is how Kaplan put it, can be. Let me read both paragraphs. Or maybe I should clarify it a little. I don't quite see how I can clarify it, since it is not clear to me yet. Kaplan affirms that the Shacharit service in its blessing of Yotzer Or and the repetition of the sentence Hamachadesh B'Tzuvo on page 71 and 72, God renews every day the work of creation, which is central to the Sabbath but also central to the Shacharit service, so it doesn't really matter which intersection we take it at. To say that God created the world in the classical sense is to say that God is responsible for good and evil. And if God is responsible for evil, no evil, Auschwitz, Vietnam, can possibly deflect us from our belief that ultimately everything is going to work out happily ever after. In spite of all the nasty things that have happened, the good is essential. Now, when we translate that from the idiom of supernaturalism to the idiom of naturalism, it adds up to the statement, which doesn't sound terribly spectacular, but we have to take very seriously, that creativity, as opposed to God as creator, creativity with a lowercase c, as opposed to creator with an uppercase c, life is not evil. To affirm creativity, to say Yotzer Or Uvorei Choshech, both in its ancient and its modern meaning, is an affirmation of hope, confidence, and faith against pessimism, despair, and hopelessness. Rubinstein raises the question of whether, in fact, only those people can act in a humane, mature, just, and righteous way who believe in this kind of creativity as being cosmic. You see, the argument isn't over this creativity, because Rubinstein, if he were in New York this week, would agree that we have experienced creativity. The issue is over whether there is some cosmic force or power that makes this happen, no matter how many times human beings and human societies backslide. In a moment, we shall designate that attitude as a myth and set it against other myths which have attempted to account for good and evil. Let me just read one paragraph from Kaplan's book, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, and one paragraph from Judaism as a Civilization, to exemplify what I mean when I say that Kaplan insists that creativity, the idea of God as creator, means that we must believe that all the evils that we see in the world are susceptible to human manipulation, change, and rectification. The ancient Jew, he writes, kept up his courage in the face of evil with the thought that he must never despair, since the Creator could at any time effect a miracle, if necessary, to remove that evil. The modern Jew, even if his scientific view of the world has led to his placing reliance on the orderly processes of nature, rather than on the possibility of their being suspended, can keep up his courage in the faith that the persistent and patient application of human intelligence to life's problems will release the creativity that will solve them. Whatever ought to be, can be, even though it is not at present in existence. I want it to be clearly understood that the need for Kaplan to make that statement so unequivocally was bound up with the fact that once there was no longer a world to come, the world to come had to be in this world, at least in microcosm. If it wasn't, Kaplan said, you couldn't have any kind of religion. Rubenstein says, even if you don't have that belief, ethnic historical religion such as Judaism is still the most tested and tried way in which to hold hands with our fellow Jews in a somewhat tragic world and do everything we can to ameliorate as much as we can a situation which is not of our creation and for which there are no ongoing, ultimate, cosmic remedies. That is the central issue. One more quotation from Kaplan. Of course, he is getting very angry in this chapter about Karl Marx and about Karl Marx's insistence that, to quote Feuerbach, der Mensch ist, was ist. The first one spoke with one S and the second one spoke with two. That man is what he eats. That man's ideals come from where he gets his next meal from. Kaplan insists that his next meal comes from where his volition is, where his ideas are. Translated into modern parlance, when we talk of the kingdom of God, this means that Jewish religion sees in human history the same inevitability which the Marxists discern. But our inevitability is the inevitability of a process which makes for righteousness. I want you to hear this. I want you to hear it quite explicitly and clearly. The issue over whether Zoroastrianism is right and monotheism is wrong, or vice versa, the issue of whether on this issue, because Reconstructionism, in my judgment, does not stand or fall with whether we take a tragic or an optimistic view. Reconstructionism has far more important fish to fry than simply the issue of a tragic or an optimistic view of life. But the issue between Rubenstein and Kaplan, which is a crucial issue, is the issue of whether or not we can believe in the, and you might ask yourselves as I am reading this quotation to you, do you believe in 1981, January? Is it still January? Yeah. Time moves so quickly these days. It's hard to have an optimistic view of life when each month follows it so quickly. Do you believe in the inevitability of a process which makes for righteousness? 20 years in America. Do we still believe in the inevitability of a process which makes for righteousness? I tend to believe in an inevitability that any time some kind of righteousness gets established briefly in American society, it's stripped up 5 minutes later by an assassination or by the leader of the community putting his foot in his mouth. And we all anxiously await precisely both of these phenomena at this moment as we end January and enter February. Do you really believe in the inevitability of a process which makes for righteousness? Or do you wish to be a Reconstructionist in the way in which Kaplan criticizes most other Jews, in a kind of a state of nebulousness, vagueness, so that we say, yeah, we're Reconstructionist, without really asking yourself, what does it mean? And am I able to subsume my real, live, now active emotions under the rubric of what Reconstructionism says? Because if one thing is for sure, Kaplan places the center of gravity now. If Kaplan were preaching this week, he would be drawing attention to the fact that never mind the rubrics and the myths and the liturgies and the words and the concepts. This week, the American people experience something of the same order that our own Jewish people were believed to have experienced at the foot of Mount Sinai. A collective experience of effervescence. The question would then be, to what extent does it grow out of righteousness, and to what extent does it lead to righteousness? Clearly the banners which said, nuke the Ayatollah, did not come from the ancient Hebraic prophets. and were not motivated by the aspirations of the rabbis who wrote the Talmud. But we don't know how widespread that feeling was, nor how widespread the desire for revenge, which even though we say we aren't going to take it, will inevitably be taken in the months to come. We're talking about, do you believe, credo, in the inevitability of a process which makes for righteousness? In all honesty, in 1981, I see no evidence for the inevitability of a process which makes for righteousness. I see righteous things happening all over the world, in the macrocosm at large, and in the microcosm of my own community and family. But as for its inevitability, I see history moving backwards and forwards, and some of the backwardses are of such profound evil that they seem to obliterate both the significant righteousness of the past and also potential righteousness to come. And of course the point that Rubenstein made was, and that's why he called his book, After Auschwitz. The paragraph that I just read, What Ought to Be Can Be, was published 4 years before the Second World War broke out. It was based on material which was used as sermons from this pulpit. The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion is a distillation prepared by Eugene Cohn of sermons preached by Rabbi Kaplan from 1922 to 1935 in this institution. He goes on, ultimately, and I'm asking you to test your own religious perspective against what I'm reading. I'm asking it quite calmly and without passion. There's no need for anybody to get excited. There's no need for anybody to get angry and go hysterical. I'm asking a very simple question. What kind of a reconstructionist are you? This is what we read in Judaism as Civilization. And this is what I have enormous difficulty in accepting. Ultimately, the forces for good that inhere in the world and in human nature will give rise to a just social order, one in which every human being will be able to achieve the full measure of self-realization and accord to his neighbor the same right and opportunity. The evolution of mankind, though marked by frequent and disheartening reactions, moves irresistibly, this is 1934, this is 1934, moves irresistibly in the direction of universal security and freedom. From the standpoint of the Jewish religion, ethical purpose does not emerge merely as an incident of social history, but is a directive and creative force. The social changes that occur as a result of mechanical inventions may be viewed as part of the divine plan. The machines, I'm thinking of some machines. I'm thinking of the gas chamber machines. The social changes that occur as a result of mechanical inventions may be viewed as part of the divine plan. Well, it's easy, of course, to be a Monday morning quarterbacker. The fact, however, remains that Rubenstein's central indictment of the concentration camps is that the evil in them was not unprecedented. The technology was unprecedented. Ancient man couldn't kill so much because after a few corpses, 50, 100, 150, you had to have a sandwich and go to sleep. But the gas ovens, because they were technologized, because of the Industrial Revolution, evil was now exponential. There is no difference between the evil of the concentration camps. There is no difference between the tortures that Hitler devised for the Jews and the communists and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists and the Russian prisoners of war that the Assyrian monarchs hadn't devised. Any student of history knows, anybody who ever read The Painted Bird by Kosinski knows that there have been very few new twists on how to make other people suffer. Anyone who has studied the history of torture knows that since the beginning of time, man has known how to make his fellow man suffer to a degree and to an extent not paralleled by his ability and know-how to make his fellow man be pleasured and feel good. The difference between Auschwitz and Assyria was in technology. One could dehumanize millions of people by making this God-given machine serve the purposes of the devil. Kaplan goes on, the machine is thus the instrument of the divine will. See how dangerous, this is the danger which all of us have to be so careful of wedding Judaism with what we call the spirit of the times. What we are saying today will stand under the judgment of history in less than 50 years' time. We, like Kaplan, have no alternative but to try to understand the meaning and purpose of Judaism for our own time. Through the machine, God's attribute as provider will be completely fulfilled. One thinks of the economic shenanigans of Brazil and the Milton Friedmans, who deliberately devise economic advice to Latin American countries which will generate large quantities of capital precisely and deliberately on the backs of starving multitudes. That is to say, in the interests of capital garnering, in the interests of large sums of capital being garnered, which will help the few in the short run and the many in the long run, all kinds of depraved torture and murder of labor is declared permissible. We've seen the torture in the short run, and we've seen the aggrandizement and the enrichment of the Somozas of life, some of whom, thank God, receive their comeuppance in the short run, but no evidence as yet is available, either in Iran or in Latin America, of the long-term economic ideal beauty which will come about because of Milton Friedman's economic problems. And now the Jewish people has finally jumped onto the bandwagon via our most distinguished magazines and spokesmen. Now we Jews have gone on the record of saying that Jimmy Carter was wrong. The one good thing that Jimmy Carter did, perhaps, to insist on international human rights. He went too far. This is what the voice of the established Jewish community now tells us. We shouldn't push the issue of human rights too far. We shouldn't raise the prophetic voice too loud. If it is in the interest of America to have a treaty and do business and have intercourse with a certain person's group of people, nation, we shouldn't make too many demands on what they do with their nationals. Is there torture there? It's all right if the best interests of America may in the long term be served by coming to terms with those countries. We should look the other way. The world isn't perfect. And what's a little bit of short-term torture on a few Salvadorians or Brazilians or Ecuadorians in the interests of long-term American success? It's a viewpoint. It's a legitimate viewpoint. Perhaps it's a legitimate viewpoint even as a Jewish viewpoint, but we shouldn't confuse it with either Kaplan's viewpoint, nor should we confuse it with the prophetic viewpoint. That is to say, the same attitude which we Jews decried when the rest of the world said of what Germany was doing in the 30s, it's a national problem. What was the beautiful phrase, what was the euphemism used? An internal problem. When the Jews began to put into concentration camps, an internal problem. One wonders what Professor Jean Kirkpatrick would have made of a treaty, a hypothetical treaty between America and Germany in the 1930s. Would the torture of the Jews been enough, too little, too much, or just right to justify us making a treaty and sharing industrial, economic, social, and political interchange? It's a question which is going to be asked increasingly and more vocally during the 60s. Through the machine, God's attribute as provider will be completely fulfilled. If in the meantime it has given the exploiters added power to enslave the masses, it is only that they might overreach themselves, as did all the arrogant rulers of mankind, who set themselves up as gods and thus brought about their own downfall. I think those two readings are beautiful. I think they represent spiritual idealism at their highest. I find in 1981 that they do not describe the world in which I live. Even, that is to say, even if we could improve society by way of sharing more with the underfed, underclothed, and the underhoused, human nature, more than physical nature, as Rubinstein repeatedly points out, man is more of an enemy to himself than anything that nature has produced. That is to say, the built-in contradictions of the human situation and the human predicament, no matter how successful society seems to be, ultimately puts a judgment on where we can go. Let's place the statement of Rabbi Kaplan within the context in which it has to be placed, the context of myth, at least so that we can understand where we stand at this point. There are two myths, neither of which can be proven, but in different eras, one seems to measure up to reality more than the other. One is the myth of eternal change, the myth that believes that every way, every day, and in every way, society is getting better and better. In the ancient world, it was called the myth of eternal change. It speaks of hope, confidence, and faith. The other myth is the myth of hopelessness, pessimism, and despair. It is usually called the myth of eternal repetition. One could, of course, try to blend the two. I want to stress only at this point that hopelessness, pessimism, and despair do not necessarily mean defeatism. One can have a tragic view of life. One can despair of what mankind can accomplish. One can have very little hope of the possibility of international peace and the kind of cooperation and well-being of which Rabbi Kaplan dreams, and still devote one's entire life to trying to ameliorate the condition of man. One thinks of Freud, of course, as one of the best examples of someone who had a most pessimistic view of the possibilities of human nature, but who devoted every ounce of his energies to trying to improve the human condition under those circumstances, and whom I regard from that perspective as a very religious person, even though he did not accept religion in the conventional sense of religion as we understand it today. There are three other dimensions in which we have to consider these two myths, the myth of eternal return, the myth of repetition, which we can very simply put as, well, statements or questions. The first is, they are views of history. The first is that history itself is cyclical and repeats itself. Nothing changes. As I believe Marcus Aurelius, who was an exponent of this view, said, if you've seen one generation, you've seen them all. That is the view of history as cyclical. The second view is a view that sees the world as a falling off from a Garden of Eden or a Golden Age. A view of history as regression. And thirdly, the view which Kaplan expounds, that history advances from age to age. You do have setbacks from time to time, like Auschwitz, like Hiroshima, like the Second World War. It doesn't wash, you see. You can talk about a regression. Maybe the 30 Years' War. I'm not even sure that. Maybe what? It's okay if you're watching from outside, but if you're inside, I don't think you welcome the regression. From the short-term point of view, the people who are in the regression don't see any advantage to an optimistic view of life. History advances, progress. There is really progress. The world is better today than it was. People are happier today than it was. These are open questions. I would like to conclude my remarks this morning with a statement from the book that I've been quoting from a great deal in recent weeks by Kurt Eisler, his interpretation of Hamlet, where he adopts a view quite diametrically opposed to Rabbi Kaplan. He suggests that whereas the world needs the optimists, we need people to stand up and say, every cloud has a silver lining. Every day and in every way the world is getting better and better. For many people, all the evidence seems to indicate that although we can satisfy man physically, we know how much food a man needs, more or less. We know how much clothing a man needs, more or less. We know how much housing a man needs, more or less. We do not know what will make man happy. And in view of that, the more human beings get, the more unhappy and the more distressed they appear to be. He draws attention to the remarkable fact that if you could take somebody from the year 1500 and promise them that in 300 years from now, you're going to have a car and a house and a garage and an internal combustion engine and gas heating and water which comes from the faucets and hot showers every morning and nutritious food and supermarkets and highways and trains and jet airplanes, a person in 1500 would regard himself as being offered something even better than the paradise his preachers had been telling him about. But that now that we have all those things, the very people who have the most of the benefits that modern society can offer them are the ones who are most disgruntled. And when it comes to creativity, the kind of creativity that is available both to enjoy today and to perform is unprecedented. It does not yet seem to have made human beings appreciative and able truly to understand the implications. Eisler says, how was it that we were able to do what we did in Vietnam? How was it we were able to drop those atom bombs, a second one without even waiting for the impact of the first to be felt and responded to? How was it that we were able to deny the reality of what was going on in the world? And he answers it by saying that in general, we are only able to survive because we avoid looking at the black side of society, the dark side of society, the hypocrisy, the inevitable retrogression, the old man in the face of the child. If we really understood, to even a modest extent, the reality of the suffering and the persecution in the world at this moment, we wouldn't have the stomach to eat our lunch. The question has to be raised, we do have to deny in order to eat lunch, but do we also have to deny in order to pray and to be Jews and to fulfill our obligations as spiritual people? Very curious story, which I will end with, where Eisler says that he talks about the period of muckraking at the beginning of this century, a period, brilliant period, filled with great social liveliness, social criticism, and sound promising social tension. Yet although the urgent necessity of reform was generally acknowledged, the most appalling disclosures of unsuspected corruption and evil in all strata of American society did not succeed in leading to any change. If there is indeed a power making for salvation, one could ask in terms of this exegesis, what was it doing? The nation resorted to social and political action only in one area, apparently, after Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906. Its social effect was greater than that of any American work of fiction since Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it was produced by a few pages in that novel that Sinclair regarded as merely incidental. In other words, something was rotten in the state of America. There were gross social evils. And those that had didn't give a damn about those that didn't have. Until somebody came along and wrote a novel and incidentally drew attention to something which galvanized American society. In a few incidental pages in Uncle Tom's Cabin, what Eisler is trying to do here is to show that this talk about the inevitability of goodness and grandeur and dignity doesn't wash. We had to wait for 444 days of captivity for this outburst of patriotism. To get rid of mugging, crime in the streets, hypocrisy in international affairs, which led to the Shah being permitted to come to this country, and which led, you can't just look at the hostages in a vacuum. The hostages belong in a context of the arrogance of American political conceit, that we somehow are above judgment. You can't just take the hostages as an isolated phenomenon. It has to be seen against the context, at least as far as I can go, the last 20 years of American life and beyond. And that is the only event that was able to galvanize. We were in a country whose secret police we in part trained, whom we helped economically and fiscally while they were ripping off arms and legs and genitals of prisoners, only a few thousand. Only a few thousand. It didn't quite rise to Jean Kirkpatrick's and Commentary magazine's standard of what a country should do before we cut off diplomatic relationships. Let's bear that in mind. It's a good point. Never mind the prisoners, what about international trade and the value of the dollar? Now, we were responsible for that. We had complicity in that. It's not just a simple black and white thing. So the hostages came home, and we had to wait for that moment to be able to rejoice. Sinclair furnished gruesome details about meat production, the casual grinding of rats, refuse, and even employees into beef products. Rationality, insight, debate, those beautiful words which Rabbi Kaplan writes about, nothing availed. Cooperation, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, needs and greed, salvation, this world, next world, jener Welt, any Welt. Gar nicht geholfen. But when an American became uncertain, this is not Eisler, I am giving a little bit of Rashi as I'm going along, but when an American became uncertain whether or not he and his family were being served human flesh at the dinner table, at that moment, the possibility of social change became transformed into a reality. By accident, or was it unconscious intuition? Sinclair touched on a spot that went beyond the possibility of denial, and thus was able to create an unbearable situation at the national level. At the same time, it was proved once again that in matters of greatest social concern, reason is powerless, and the magic curses of Moses are the only efficient tools. Archaic, cannibalistic imagery and the horror thereof had to be injected into the clamor for reform. I have to end this week on a somewhat chastened note, that perhaps when we can find some primitive, archaic way of drawing our attention to the need for crucial and urgent social reform in areas other than the content of hot dogs, we will have begun to move along a path which might give more meaning to the concept of there being a power that makes for creativity in the world in which we live. We rise for Aleinu on page 192.